I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened on my land. I am not a hero. I am not brave. I am a 53-year-old soybean farmer from the eastern edge of Mercer County. And the only reason 200 people didn't die that night is because I've spent my entire adult life watching water move through dirt. That's it. That's the whole qualification. I understood drainage. I understood gravity. And when the moment arrived, where no rational option remained, I understood that the land I'd spent 30 years building could be turned into a weapon if I was willing to destroy it. My name is Earl Brundage. My wife, Colleen, passed 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. And since then, I've worked the farm alone, except for my nephew, Davis, who drives out from Millhaven 3 days a week to help with equipment. Davis is 26, built like a fence post, and more competent than he lets on. He was with me that Thursday evening when the first phone call came. It was my neighbor, Grace Yoon. Grace runs a 70-acre organic operation across the county road. She's 61, Korean-born, came to the States in the 80s, and she doesn't panic. Not during the derecho of 2020, not during the chemical spill at the grain elevator, not ever. So when I heard her voice shaking on the other end of the line, something inside my rib cage went cold. Earl, there's something wrong with Martin's cattle. Martin Koss owned the dairy operation 2 miles north. I drove past 20 minutes ago, and 3 of them were standing in the drainage ditch biting each other. Not butting heads, biting. One of them had its jaw hanging loose and it was still chewing on the other one's neck. I told her it might be rabies. She said she'd thought about that. But then she told me she stopped the truck and one of them turned toward her. She said its eyes were wrong, not cloudy the way a sick animal looks. She described them as overexposed, like a photograph left in the sun. Davis was sitting on the porch eating a ham sandwich, and he watched my face change while I listened. I hung up and told him what Grace said. He set the sandwich down and said, "I saw something online this morning, some kind of outbreak near Columbus. People attacking EMTs outside a hospital. I thought it was fake." I wish it had been. I went inside and turned on the television, something I rarely do during planting season. The local affiliate out of Dayton was running a crawl across the bottom of the screen. Unusual aggressive incidents reported in Franklin and Pickaway counties. Residents advised to avoid contact with symptomatic individuals. Symptoms include involuntary jaw movement, loss of verbal response, and photosensitive ocular hemorrhaging. I read that last phrase 3 times. Photosensitive ocular hemorrhaging. That's a clinical way of saying their eyes were bleeding when exposed to light. That's not rabies. That's not anything I'd ever heard of in cattle or people. Davis pulled up his phone and showed me a video someone had posted from a gas station camera near Circleville. It was grainy, time-stamped from that morning. And it showed a woman in a hospital gown walking across the parking lot toward a man filling his truck. She moved with a stutter, not limping, not staggering. It was like her muscles were firing in the wrong order. The man turned around, and she was on him. He went down behind the truck, and the camera couldn't see what happened next. But another figure came from the tree line. Same walk, same broken rhythm. Then a third. Davis looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said the word. We didn't have to. Every American over the age of 12 knows what that movement pattern means, even if they've never seen it outside of fiction. "That's 60 miles from here," Davis said. 60 miles is 3 hours by foot if they don't stop walking. He stared at me. "You think they don't stop walking?" I didn't answer him. I walked to the barn and started checking the fuel levels on every piece of equipment I owned. I didn't know yet what I was planning, but my hands did. The next 2 hours were a negotiation between common sense and instinct. Common sense said this was regional, containable, probably exaggerated by social media. Instinct said, check the irrigation valves. I listened to instinct. My farm sits in a natural depression. 320 acres shaped like a shallow bowl, with Dyer's Creek running along the northern boundary and a network of drainage tiles. I installed myself over 15 years, feeding runoff toward the southeast corner. The topography means that if the creek overflows or if significant water enters from the western slope, the center of my property floods. This has happened twice in my lifetime. Both times, it took months to dry out. Both times, I nearly lost the crop. But that geography, the thing that's been my curse every wet spring, suddenly looked different to me. I stood at the edge of the north field, and I saw it not as farmland, but as a basin, a trap, a killing floor made of mud and water if someone was desperate enough to pull the trigger. I wasn't desperate yet, not at that point. But I started doing math. Grace called again at 7:15. She said Martin Koss wasn't answering his phone. She'd driven up toward his property, and his dairy barn was open, and there were no cattle visible, but she could hear sounds from inside. She described the sounds as wet, rhythmic and wet, like a mechanical process involving tissue. She didn't get out of the truck. She turned around and came home and locked her doors. I called the Mercer County Sheriff's non-emergency line. Busy. Called the emergency line. An automated system told me all dispatchers were engaged and to remain on the line. I waited 9 minutes, and then a human voice picked up, sounding like someone who hadn't slept. I told her about the cattle and about Martin. She said they were aware of livestock disturbances throughout the county and that residents should shelter in place until further notice. Shelter in place for how long? I asked. She paused. Sir, I don't have that information. Please stay indoors. That was the moment. That pause. I've replayed it 1,000 times. In that silence, I heard every emergency protocol failing simultaneously. I heard a woman who was supposed to have answers realizing she had none. Davis was standing in the kitchen doorway. What do we do? I sat down at the table where Colleen and I ate every meal for 27 years. I put my hands flat on the wood and I thought about the farm. Not the soybeans, not the crop insurance, not the mortgage. I thought about the physical shape of the earth beneath my feet. I need you to drive to Pullman's Hardware before they close, I said. Buy every sandbag they have, every one. Put it on my account. Sandbags? For what? If I block the southeast drainage outlet and open the creek gate on the north boundary, I can flood the center 40 acres in under 2 hours. Davis looked at me like I'd suggested burning the house down. That'll destroy the entire planting. I know. That's your whole season, Earl. That's everything. I know what it is. He stood there, and I watched him do the calculation I'd already done. A season's crop against whatever was making its way toward us from Columbus. Against Martin Koss's unanswered phone. Against that woman in the gas station video, moving with broken clockwork in her legs. How deep would it get? He asked. Center of the basin, maybe 3.5 feet if I let the creek run wide open. Edges would be shallower. The slope on the west side would stay above water. 3.5 feet doesn't stop a person. It stops a person who can barely walk on dry ground. You saw that video. Their coordination is destroyed. They can't balance. Put them in knee-deep mud and moving water, and they're done. He picked up his truck keys. How many sandbags? All of them. He left. I stood alone in the kitchen and put my hand on the counter. and felt the house settle the way it does in the evening when the temperature drops. Outside the window, my soybeans were 6 inches tall, the most promising stand I'd had in years. By morning, they'd be underwater. I was about to murder my own farm to save my neighbors. Davis came back at 8:40 with his truck bed stacked to the rails. Pullman's had 96 sandbags left, and Davis bought them all. He also bought the last 4 rolls of plastic sheeting, which I hadn't asked for, but was glad to see. The kid thinks ahead when it matters. We started at the southeast drainage outlet, the lowest point on the property where the tile system empties into a concrete culvert that feeds a roadside ditch. That culvert is how my fields drain after rain. Block it, and the water has nowhere to go. The basin fills. It took us an hour to stack the sandbags 3 high across the culvert mouth and seal the edges with plastic sheeting weighted down by gravel. My back was screaming by the halfway point. Davis never complained, but I could see him glancing north every few minutes, toward Martin's property, toward the darkness gathering there. While we worked, I called Grace. "I need you to come to my place. Bring anything important. Don't go to Martin's." I wasn't planning to go to Martin's. "Good. Come now. Use the county road, not the field access." "Earl, what are you doing?" I can hear you breathing hard. "I'm flooding my farm." Silence. Then, "On purpose?" "There's a natural basin here. 40 acres in the center, low enough to hold 3 feet of water if I dam the outlet and open the creek. Anything coming through from the north or east has to cross it." "You think they're coming from the north?" "Martin's not answering his phone, Grace. His barn sounds wrong. His cattle were eating each other this afternoon. Yes, I think they're coming from the north." She arrived 20 minutes later with a duffel bag, a .410 shotgun that had belonged to her late husband, and a bag of rice. She looked at the sandbags across the culvert and at the plastic sheeting, and she nodded once, the way a person nods when they've accepted that reality has shifted categories. "What about the creek gate?" she asked. The creek gate is a manual sluice I installed in 2014 to control overflow from Dyer's Creek into my irrigation channels. In normal operation, I keep it mostly closed, allowing a controlled trickle into the field channels. Wide open, it diverts the full flow of the creek, which was running high from 3 days of spring rain, directly onto my north field, which slopes downward into the basin. "That's next," I said. The 3 of us drove the ATV up to the creek boundary. The gate mechanism is simple. A hand-cranked steel plate that slides vertically in a concrete frame. I'd greased it in March. It moved smooth. I cranked it all the way open, and the creek poured through like it had been waiting for permission. The sound changed the air. What had been a quiet evening became something urgent, liquid, and relentless. Standing there, I could see across the creek to the tree line on Martin's side. Nothing moved. But the dairy barn light was on, which shouldn't have made me nervous, except that Martin is fanatical about his electric bill and never leaves lights burning after evening milking. "We should go back to the house," Grace said. "Wait." Davis was pointing. Not at the barn. At the field between the barn and the creek, something was moving in the soybean stubble from Martin's last season. A shape, upright, moving with that hitching gait I'd seen on the gas station video. Then another shape behind it. Then a third, further back near the fence line. My breath stopped. They were human-shaped. They were walking south, toward the creek, toward my land. "Go," I said. "Back to the house, now." We mounted the ATV and I drove faster than I should have over uneven ground in fading light. Behind us, The creek gate was wide open, pouring thousands of gallons per minute onto my north field. Ahead of us, the house sat on the highest point of the property, 12 feet above the basin floor. I'd built it there because my grandfather told me to. He said never build in a hole. For 40 years, I thought he was talking about flooding. He was talking about survival. By 10 o'clock, the north field was a shallow lake. I stood on the porch with a flashlight and watched the water creep south across the soybean rows. My soybeans were drowning. 6 inches of careful growth vanishing under brown creek water that carried silt and debris and the particular smell of spring runoff, iron and earth and something vegetal and alive. The crop was dying, and I felt it in my chest the way you feel a relationship ending. A slow, sinking recognition that what was there will never come back the same way. Davis was inside, monitoring his phone. Cell service was intermittent, but he'd found a live Reddit thread aggregating reports from across central Ohio. The picture was worse than I'd imagined. Columbus had declared a state of emergency at 6 p.m. The National Guard had been activated but was deploying to urban centers first. Rural counties were told to shelter in place. 3 hospitals were non-operational. The infection vector was still unidentified but appeared to be transmitted through bite wounds, and the progression from bite to full symptomatic transformation was estimated between 45 minutes and 2 hours, depending on wound severity. He read me one post from someone claiming to be a nurse at Riverside Methodist. She wrote, "They don't die. I need you to understand that. The heart stops, the EEG goes flat, and then they sit up. They sit up and their eyes are hemorrhaging, and they bite whoever is closest. We've lost 11 staff members. We are no longer treating bite patients. I don't care if that violates my oath. We are locking the ward." Grace was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning her shotgun with a methodical calm that told me she'd already processed the reality and moved to the operational phase. Grace survived things in Korea before she immigrated that she has never told me about, and I've never asked. But I've always sensed a bedrock in her that goes deeper than farming. "How many did you see at Martin's?" she asked without looking up. "3 that I could identify, maybe more in the tree line. Martin has 20 employees during milking season. If he's gone, they might be 2. I hadn't thought about that. 20 people. Some of them lived in trailers on the north end of Martin's property. If the infection had moved through the dairy operation, we weren't looking at 3. We were looking at potentially 24, plus whatever was coming behind them from further north and east. "The creek will slow them down," I said. "It's running high. The current's strong. And if they cross it? Then they walk into the basin, which is filling right now. By midnight, the center will be 2 feet deep. By dawn, 3 feet in the lowest areas." Grace set down the cleaning rod. "Earl, if they can't walk well on dry ground, what happens when they hit standing water with a mud bottom?" "They fall, and they can't get back up. Not if the water's above their knees and the mud takes their footing. They drown." The word sat in the room. I'd been avoiding it. I'd been telling myself I was creating a barrier, a moat, a defensive perimeter of water and terrain. But Grace said it plainly, and I had to face what I was actually building. A drowning pool, 40 acres of it. "If they're already dead," Davis said from the doorway, "you can't drown them." The nurse said the heart stops. She didn't say they can breathe underwater. "Do they breathe at all?" Nobody answered that. We didn't know. Nobody knew. The science, if there was any, was hours old and contradictory and buried under panic. All I had was logic. If their motor control was degraded to the point where walking was compromised, Then swimming was impossible. If their bodies still required some form of respiratory function, then submersion would halt it. If the mud was soft and deep enough, and after 15 years of tile drainage pushing fine silt into that basin it was, then any bipedal creature with impaired coordination would sink past its ankles on the first step and past its knees by the third. I wasn't certain it would work. I was certain that nothing else would. The sheriff wasn't coming. The guard wasn't coming. We had a shotgun, a flooded field, and 3 hours until whatever was gathering in the darkness reached my fence line. At 10:30, I made calls. My phone had 2 bars of signal, and I used them like currency, spending each one deliberately. First, I called Ruth Emberly, who lives a half-mile southwest with her husband Cal and their teenage daughter Karen. Cal picked up on the first ring. He'd seen the news. He'd locked the doors. I told him to come to my place and bring any firearms. "Why your place?" he asked. "Because my place is on high ground, and I've just flooded 40 acres around it. If they come, they have to go through water to reach us." Cal arrived in 12 minutes with Ruth and Karen in the truck. Cal is a retired electrician, stocky and deliberate. Ruth teaches 5th grade in Millhaven. Karen is 17, quiet in the way teenagers are when they're actually paying attention to everything. Cal brought a deer rifle and a box of ammunition. Ruth brought a first aid kit and 3 gallons of drinking water. Karen brought a backpack full of canned food and a hand-crank radio she'd ordered online for emergencies. That radio would save us. Next, I reached Paul Verdon, a retired Army engineer who lives on a 10-acre parcel east of the county road. Paul is 70, lean as a whip, and the kind of man who thinks in systems. I told him what I'd done: the sandbags, the creek gate, the flooding. And he was silent for so long, I thought the call had dropped. "That's brilliant," he said finally. "That's the most redneck military engineering I've ever heard of, and it's brilliant. I'm coming. Give me 15 minutes. Paul arrived with his own truck loaded with things I hadn't thought of. Road flares, a chainsaw, a come-along winch, 50 feet of heavy chain, and a portable generator. He walked the property with a flashlight, evaluated the water spread, checked the sandbag dam, and came back to the porch with a tactical assessment. "Your western slope is exposed," he said. "The water won't reach the ridge on that side. If they come from the west, they bypass the basin entirely." "What do you suggest?" "Fell trees. Block the access points on the west ridge with deadfall. It won't stop them permanently, but it'll funnel them downhill into the water." Davis and Paul took the chainsaw into the dark. I could hear it snarling in the tree line for the next hour as they dropped oaks and maples across the 2 paths that led down the western slope onto my property. The sound of trees falling in the darkness had a finality to it that made Ruth put her hand over her mouth. We had 8 people now, including Karen, who was systematically inventorying all the food in my kitchen with a focus that bordered on military. She wrote everything on the back of an envelope in neat columns: canned goods, dry goods, water supply, medical supplies, fuel reserves. "Karen," Ruth said, "come sit down." "Mom, someone has to count the food." She didn't look up. She was right. Someone did have to count the food, and none of the adults had thought to do it yet, because we were all still processing the emotional reality, while this 17-year-old had already moved to logistics. At 11, I walked to the edge of the north field with Paul's binoculars. The water was spreading beautifully, if that's a word you can use for destruction. The soybean rows were gone. The ground was a mirror reflecting the half-moon, rippled by the current still pushing south from the open creek gate. In the moonlight, I could see the shapes of my irrigation risers standing above the water like small grave markers. And beyond the water, across the creek, I could see lights moving in Martin's farmyard. Not flashlights, not vehicle headlights. Something dimmer, intermittent. Later, I would learn it was the barn's electrical system shorting as bodies pressed against the junction boxes, but at the time, it looked like the whole property was blinking, signaling in some broken code I couldn't read. Then I heard the sound. It carried across the water and through the night air with a clarity that still wakes me from sleep. A collective moan, low and continuous, without rhythm or variation. Not a scream, not a cry, just a sustained exhalation from dozens of throats that no longer had the neural wiring to form words. They were gathering at the creek. The first ones entered the water at 11:22. I know the exact time because Karen had started a log. She sat on the porch with a flashlight and a notebook, and she wrote down everything she observed, time-stamped to the minute. I didn't ask her to do this. She simply began. Later, when people wanted to understand what happened that night, Karen's log was the only coherent record. From the porch, using Paul's binoculars, I could see the north field clearly in the moonlight. The creek gate was still pouring water, and the basin was filling steadily. The first figure came down the bank on Martin's side, slid into the creek, and was carried 20 feet downstream before it found footing on my side. It stood up in the shallows, water streaming off clothing that might once have been a Cost Dairy Works shirt, and began walking south, into the basin. It made it about 40 yards. The water was only 18 inches deep at that point, but the bottom was soft. Years of accumulated silt from tile drainage, the consistency of wet cement. The figure's feet sank with each step. Its gait, already compromised by whatever had rewired its motor cortex, became a lurching, tipping struggle. It fell forward at step 30-something. It tried to push itself up. Its arms went into the mud to the elbows. It got its head above water, mouth working mechanically. And then it fell again. This time, it didn't resurface. Grace was standing beside me. She lowered the binoculars she'd been sharing and handed them to Cal without a word. Her face was unreadable. "It worked," Davis said from behind us. "One worked," I said. "Wait." More were coming. They slid and tumbled down the creek bank in ones and twos, not in a coordinated wave, but in the staggered procession of things drawn by stimulus without strategy. Some were swept downstream by the current and washed up against the fence line where the creek bends, tangling in barbed wire. Others made it across and began the same doomed march into the basin. Paul counted them through the binoculars with a soldier's detachment. 14 in the water, 2 down in the mud, 3 caught in the fence wire, 9 still moving south. The 9 who were still moving fanned out as the water deepened. Some found slightly higher ground along the old equipment path, where the soil was more compacted. These ones made it further, 60, 70 yards, before the mud claimed them. Others walked straight into the deepest part of the basin, where the water was already 2 feet deep, and the bottom was the silty muck that had been the bane of my farming existence. They went down fast. There is a particular horror in watching something humanoid struggle in water. Every instinct in your body screams to help. Your muscles tense for rescue. The woman next to me, Ruth, was gripping the porch railing so hard I could hear the wood creak. Her knuckles were white, and she was crying without making a sound. "Those aren't people anymore," Paul said, not cruelly. He said it the way a medic says a patient is gone. A statement of clinical reality meant to prevent the living from destroying themselves trying to save the dead. Cal put his arm around Ruth. Karen kept writing in her notebook. By midnight, Paul's count was 37. 37 had entered the water. 22 were down and not moving. 15 were still struggling at various depths across the basin, some of them stuck in mud up to their thighs, rocking back and forth with a persistence that would have been admirable if it weren't terrifying. They didn't tire. They didn't stop. They just gradually sank deeper as their movements worked them further into the silt. The water was still rising. The creek gate was delivering a relentless flow. And with the southeast outlet dammed, every gallon stayed in the basin. I checked the water line against a fence post I'd mentally marked and estimated the level had risen 4 inches in the last hour. By dawn, the center would be over 3 feet. Anything under 6 feet tall would be submerged. "How long does this go on?" Grace asked. "Until the creek stops flowing or they stop coming." She looked at me with those steady eyes. What if neither of those things happens? At 1 in the morning, the hand crank radio Karen brought picked up an emergency broadcast from the state level. The governor had declared martial law across 14 counties. Columbus was described as non-functional. Interstate 71 was closed in both directions. Military units were establishing a perimeter around the greater metropolitan area. But the infection had already spread beyond containment lines through rural corridors, following roads and waterways and the paths of least resistance that fleeing people had used. Carry-sounding bites they didn't yet know would transform them. The broadcast used the word reanimation. That was the first official acknowledgement I heard. Not infection, not illness, not aggression. Reanimation. The dead were getting back up. Whatever this pathogen was, it didn't just alter behavior. It restarted biological function after cessation. The nurse on Reddit had been right. Heart stops, brain goes flat, and then they sit up. Paul listened to the broadcast with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture I'd come to recognize as his thinking stance. When it ended, he turned to me. "Earl, your basin is going to attract more than Martin's people. If anyone, infected or otherwise, is moving through this area following the creek, they're going to hit your water. That's good for defense, but it means the numbers could be much higher than 20 or 30. "How many are you thinking?" "Depends on the population density upstream. Dyer's Creek runs through 4 townships before it reaches your property. If the infection is moved along that corridor, you could be looking at hundreds." The word landed like a stone in a still pond. Hundreds. My 40-acre basin, my sacrificed soybean crop, my sandbag dam. I'd built it for dozens. I'd imagined a neighborhood-scale threat. Paul was describing a regional one. "The physics don't change," I said, more to convince myself than him. "The mud doesn't care how many there are. The water doesn't care." "No, but the volume does. Bodies accumulate. If enough of them go down in the same area, the ones behind them walk on top of the fallen. They build a bridge of their own dead. I've seen it in military history. Human wave tactics work not because the soldiers survive, but because their bodies create passage for those who follow." I hadn't considered that. The image was grotesque. A ramp of submerged corpses providing footing across the deepest section of the basin. But it was physically plausible. If enough infected entered the water in the same corridor, the first wave would sink and the second wave would walk on top of them, partially supported above the drowning depth. "We need to disperse them," Paul said. "Spread the entry points so they don't concentrate." "How?" "Sound. They're attracted to sound. We set up noise sources at multiple points along the north boundary. They'll follow the closest one, and if we space them right, they'll enter the water across a wide front instead of a single column." Davis volunteered. He took the portable generator and a Bluetooth speaker from his truck and drove the ATV along the north field edge, placing sound sources at 3 points. At each one, he played music at moderate volume, whatever was on his phone. Country, hip-hop, a podcast about motorcycle repair. The content didn't matter. The sound did. Within 20 minutes, the pattern changed. Instead of clustering at the point where the creek crossing was easiest, the infected began spreading along the north boundary, drawn to different sound sources. They entered the water at intervals across the full width of the basin. And instead of a concentrated column, they became a scattered line of individual figures, each one isolated in its own pocket of deep mud and rising water. Davis came back to the house shaking. Not from cold. His hands were trembling, and his jaw was tight, and he sat on the kitchen floor and put his head between his knees. "I was 30 feet from one of them," he said, setting up the speaker near the east corner. "It came out of the tree line while I was crouching by the fence. I could see its face." What did it look like? Like a person having the worst dream of their life. Like someone screaming inside a body they can't control. I handed him coffee. He drank it with both hands wrapped around the mug. Between 1 and 3 in the morning, the basin did its work with a terrible patience. Karen's log recorded the arrivals in clusters, 12 between 1 and 1:15. A pause. Then 8 more at 1:30. Another pause. Then a sustained flow of 3 to 5 per minute starting around 2 o'clock that didn't stop for over an hour. They came from the north, mostly, across the creek from Martin's land and from the townships beyond. But some came from the northeast, emerging from the wooded corridor along Route 47, where the tree line meets the county road. These were not dairy workers. Their clothing was varied. I saw through the binoculars a woman in a business suit, a teenager in a basketball jersey, a man in what appeared to be a paramedic's uniform, the reflective striping catching moonlight as he staggered into the water. Each one followed the same pattern. Enter the basin, walk toward the sound sources, slow as the water reached their thighs, begin to tip and stagger as the mud took their feet, fall, struggle, sink. Some lasted longer than others. The taller ones sometimes made it 50 or 60 yards before they went down. The shorter ones barely made it past the waterline. The sound they made was the worst part. Not the moaning. I'd adjusted to that. The way you adjust to highway noise or persistent wind. It was the splashing, the frantic, arrhythmic slapping of hands and arms against water as they tried to right themselves. It sounded like drowning, because it was drowning. And no matter how many times Paul reminded us they were clinically dead, the sound bypassed reason and went straight to the part of the brain that recognizes a fellow creature fighting for air. Ruth went inside at 2:30 and didn't come back out. Cal followed her. I could hear her crying through the screen door, deep, exhausted sobs that she tried to muffle with a towel. Karen stayed on the porch. She kept writing. At 2:45, something changed. Grace spotted it first. A group was approaching from the west, coming down the slope that Paul and Davis had blocked with felled trees. There were perhaps 15 of them, moving through the woods in a loose cluster. They hit the first deadfall, a massive white oak Davis had dropped across the main trail. And they didn't stop. They didn't go around. They climbed over it, slowly, clumsily, their bodies bending at wrong angles as they hauled themselves across the trunk. 3 fell on the far side and didn't get up, tangled in branches. The rest kept coming. "Paul," I said. He was already watching. "The deadfall slowed them down, but it won't hold. There's no water on that slope." This was the vulnerability he'd identified hours earlier. The western ridge was too high for the basin flooding to reach. Anything coming from that direction would arrive on dry ground, bypassing the drowning field entirely and reach the house. "I need ideas," I said. "Right now." Paul looked at Cal, who had come back to the porch when Grace raised the alarm. "You're an electrician." "Retired. I have a generator, 50 feet of heavy chain, and 600 feet of copper wire in my truck. Can you rig a ground-level deterrent across that slope?" Cal's eyes narrowed. He was thinking. I could see circuits assembling behind his expression. "The ground's wet from the overflow. Wet ground conducts. If I lay copper wire across the path in a grid pattern and connect it to the generator through a step-up transformer." "Do you have a transformer?" "I have an arc welder." "That'll work. The output won't kill anything that's already dead. But the current will cause involuntary muscle contraction. They'll lock up, fall down. In wet conditions, the effective radius could be 10 or 15 feet around each wire." "Do it," I said. Cal and Davis spent the next 90 minutes in the darkness on the western slope, laying wire in a zigzag pattern across the approach, connecting it back to Paul's generator through the arc welder's transformer. It was dangerous work. One slip, one contact with a live wire on wet ground, and they'd be the ones convulsing. But Cal worked with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years handling current that could kill him. And Davis followed his instructions without deviation. By 4 o'clock, the western slope was wired. The trap was tested almost immediately. The cluster that had been climbing over the deadfall reached the wire grid at 4:12. The first one stepped onto the copper and its legs went rigid. It toppled forward, stiff as a plank, face first into the wet grass. The second walked into the same section and seized up identically. The third made it 2 steps further before the current found it through the saturated soil. They piled up along the wire grid like cordwood. 12 of them in 20 minutes, locked in contorted positions by sustained electrical impulse, twitching but unable to advance. The generator hummed steadily from behind the house. Cal monitored the amperage from the porch, making adjustments to keep the current in the range that would incapacitate without drawing so much power that the generator overloaded. "How long will the fuel last?" I asked. "At this draw, maybe 6 hours. 7 if I reduce the output to pulses instead of continuous." "Do that. We need it to last until daylight." The basin continued to fill, both with water and with the infected. Karen's count at 4:30 was 112. 112 had entered the water. The vast majority were down. A handful were still upright in the shallows at the basin's edge, where the water was only ankle deep and the mud was firmer. These ones concerned me. They were stuck but not incapacitated, rocking and stepping in small circles, unable to advance into deeper water but unwilling to retreat. Grace handled it. She walked to the north edge of the property with her dot 410 and her flashlight. I followed her because I didn't want her out there alone. "What are you doing?" I asked. "There are 7 of them standing in the shallows on the east side. They're not going deeper on their own. If they stay there and more come up behind them, they'll start to mass. Mass gives them a platform." She was right. Paul's theory about bodies creating bridges applied to the shallows too. If enough infected accumulated in ankle-deep water near the basin's edge, they'd create a solid zone that others could cross. Grace raised the shotgun and fired into the water 10 feet in front of the nearest standing figure. Birdshot. The splash and sound drew its attention, and it lurched toward the impact point, deeper into the basin. It took 4 steps and went down. She repeated this with the next one and the next, using the sound of the shot hitting water to lure them into the deeper center. It was herding. She was herding them like livestock, using sound instead of dogs, guiding them into the kill zone with the patience and precision of a woman who'd spent 30 years managing animals on difficult terrain. "Grace Yoon," Paul said from behind us, watching through binoculars, "you are a terrifying woman." "I'm a practical woman," she said, and fired again. By 5 o'clock, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. The basin was a horror. The water's surface was broken by shapes, some still moving, most still. Arms extended above the waterline at odd angles. A head here and there, jaw still working mechanically even as the body below it was mired in 3 feet of mud and water. The moaning had thinned as fewer throats remained above surface to produce it. But it hadn't stopped entirely. Individual sounds of distress, if you could call it distress in things that lacked consciousness, drifted across the water like the calls of strange birds. I stood on the porch and looked at what I'd done. My farm was gone. The soybeans, the topsoil I'd spent decades building, the drainage infrastructure I'd installed tile by tile with my own hands. All of it submerged, contaminated, ruined. The financial loss was absolute. Insurance doesn't cover deliberate flooding. The USDA doesn't have a program for voluntary crop destruction in the course of zombie defense. I was looking at bankruptcy, at losing the land that 4 generations of Brundages had worked. And I was looking at 8 living people on my porch, including a 17-year-old girl with a notebook full of careful observations, who were alive because I'd opened a gate and let the water do what water does. The sun came up. The moaning continued. But the water held. Dawn brought clarity in the most brutal sense. With full daylight, we could see the entire basin. And what we saw would define every nightmare I'd have for the rest of my life. The flooded 40 acres had become a tableau of arrested motion. Bodies lay at every angle beneath the brown water, some fully submerged, others partially exposed. Hands reaching upward, faces pressed into mud, backs arched in the posture of final struggle. The water itself had turned a color I'd never seen in any flood. Dark, with an oily iridescence that caught the early sun and threw it back in sickly prisms. Karen's final count, logged at 6:14 a.m., when the last straggler entered the water from the northeast tree line, was 193 confirmed entries. Paul estimated at least another dozen had gone down in the creek itself or in the fence wire along the north boundary, putting the total near 210. 210 people. Former people. I kept reminding myself of that distinction. But the word former does less work than you'd think when you're staring at a field full of human shapes. Paul walked the perimeter at first light with Cal, both of them armed, checking every approach. The western slope held. 21 infected lay along Cal's wire grid, frozen in electrical rigor. The generator was still running on fumes. Cal disconnected the current, and the bodies remained motionless. Whether permanently incapacitated or temporarily paralyzed, we couldn't tell, and weren't willing to test. The creek was still flowing through the open gate, but the water level in the basin had stabilized. Some was leaking through the sandbag dam at the southeast outlet, not enough to drain the basin, but enough to prevent further rise. The equilibrium was holding. Davis found Martin, or what had been Martin. He was in the creek, tangled in the intake grate of my irrigation pump, recognizable only by the Cost dairy cap still on his head. His body had the gray, mottled complexion that all the infected shared, and his jaw was locked open in that persistent mechanical gape. Davis shut off the pump and walked back to the house without speaking. He sat on the tailgate of his truck and stared at the ground for a long time. Martin had taught Davis to drive a tractor when he was 12. Martin had been at Davis's high school graduation. People don't stop being people to you just because biology has reclassified them. The radio brought more information as the morning progressed. The military had established safe zones in Dayton and Springfield. Evacuation routes were being cleared along specific corridors. Helicopter extraction was available for isolated groups if they could reach a designated landing zone, the nearest of which was 18 miles southeast at a high school football field. 18 miles, Ruth said. She was functioning again, pale but composed, her teacher's pragmatism reasserting itself. That's doable by vehicle if the roads are clear. The roads won't be clear, Paul said. Every car between here and there will be either abandoned or occupied by someone desperate. And the infected follow roads. They follow the paths of least resistance, same as water. Every highway will be a corridor of exposure. So we stay, I said. For now. Your basin is the most effective defensive position I've seen, improvised or otherwise. The military will expand outward from the safe zones. They'll reach us eventually. We have food, water, shelter, and a perimeter. We stay. Nobody argued. The decision was made not by consensus, but by exhaustion. We'd been awake for over 24 hours. The adrenaline that had carried us through the night was metabolizing into a bone-deep fatigue that made even the act of standing feel like an assertion of will. Grace organized sleeping shifts. 2 people awake at all times, monitoring the basin and the western slope. Everyone else sleeps. She assigned rotations with the quiet authority of someone who has managed complex operations and difficult personalities. And nobody questioned her assignments, not even Paul, who outranked everyone in military experience, but recognized command competence when he saw it. I took the first sleep shift. I lay on the couch where Colleen used to read her mystery novels, and I closed my eyes, and I smelled the flood water through the open windows, and I slept like the dead. The irony of that phrase isn't lost on me. I woke at noon to the sound of a helicopter. It passed east of us at low altitude, military green, moving fast toward the safe zone in Springfield. Grace was on the porch watching it. She handed me coffee without being asked. She'd found the good beans in the back of the pantry and had made a full pot using the camping stove, since the power had gone out at dawn. "Anything happen while I was down?" I asked. 3 more came from the northeast around 8. They went into the water. They're down now. Paul thinks the flow is stopping. Most of what was upstream has already come through. I sipped the coffee. It was strong and hot, and it made the world feel slightly more navigable. From the porch, I could see the basin glittering in the midday sun. Deceptively beautiful if you didn't know what lay beneath the surface. A great blue heron was standing at the edge of the water, motionless, as if considering whether this new lake offered anything worth hunting. Something about that bird, that refusal to acknowledge catastrophe, going about its business of finding fish in a field full of the dead, it broke something loose in me. I set down the coffee and I cried. Not for long, maybe 2 minutes, but hard, the kind of crying that comes from the diaphragm and takes your breath. Grace put her hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything. When I was done, I wiped my face and picked up the coffee, and we went back to watching the water. The afternoon brought a new problem. The infected in the basin were not all dead. Paul had observed through binoculars that some of the partially submerged figures were still exhibiting movement. Jaw articulation, arm extension, slow grasping motions. These were trapped in mud to their waists or deeper, unable to free themselves, but technically still active. The concern was degradation of the dam. If the sandbags shifted or the water level dropped for any reason, Some of these might be released from the mud as it dried and firmed. "We need to maintain the water level indefinitely," Paul said. "As long as that creek is flowing, the basin stays full, and they stay submerged. The moment it drains, you've got an unknown number of active infected stuck in drying mud that might eventually release them." "The creek will keep flowing," I said. "It's spring-fed upstream. We've had a wet year. It won't dry up." "What about the dam?" "Those sandbags weren't designed for sustained hydrostatic pressure. If one section fails, the basin drains through the culvert in hours." I looked at Davis. "We reinforce the dam. More sandbags, more plastic. We build it up until it's permanent." "With what sandbags?" "We used every one Pullman's had." Cal cleared his throat. "I've got 200 cinder blocks in my barn, left over from a retaining wall project I never finished. We could stack them against the sandbags. It's not elegant, but it's structural." By mid-afternoon, Cal and Davis had shuttled cinder blocks from Cal's barn in 3 truckloads. They stacked them against the sandbag dam in a crude but effective buttress, filling the blocks with mud scooped from the edge of the flooded field. Paul supervised the engineering with the focused intensity of a man for whom infrastructure was a language. While they worked, I walked the north boundary with Grace. The creek gate was still wide open, water pouring through with the steady voice of controlled destruction. On the far bank, Martin's property was silent. No movement, no sound, no blinking lights. Whatever had gathered there in the night had spent itself against my basin. "Earl," Grace said as we stood by the gate, "you know this land is never coming back. Even if you drain it eventually, the soil is contaminated. Whatever pathogen they carry is in the water now, in the mud. This isn't farmland anymore." I looked at her. She wasn't being cruel. She was being accurate, the way she always is, her observations landing with the precision of seeds dropped into prepared rows. "I know," I said. "What will you do?" "I haven't thought that far yet. Think about it, because the world we're going back to, whenever this ends, won't have room for people who haven't thought about what comes next." The second night was quieter. Only 4 more infected came through after dark, all from the north, all drawn by the residual sound of the generator. They entered the basin and went down within minutes. The water level held. Cal's cinder block reinforcement had turned the sandbag dam into something approximating a permanent structure. Paul declared the perimeter stable and reduced watch rotations to 1 person at a time. We gathered in the kitchen for the first real meal any of us had eaten since the previous evening. Grace cooked rice with canned vegetables and a surprising amount of skill, transforming my sparse pantry into something that tasted like actual food rather than survival rations. We sat around the table, 8 people who 24 hours earlier had been leading separate, ordinary lives. And we ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but was laden with the weight of shared experience that none of us had the energy to process aloud. Karen broke the silence. "I've been doing the math," she said. "Based on my count and Mr. Verdon's estimates, approximately 206 infected individuals were neutralized by the basin flooding. If each of those individuals had continued walking south at the average pace I observed, roughly 1 mile per hour, they would have reached Millhaven by mid-morning. Millhaven's population is 4,000. The table went still. Millhaven, where Davis lives, where Ruth teaches, where 4,000 people were sleeping in their beds last night, protected not by military intervention or government action, but by a soybean farmer who opened a creek gate. "You didn't just save us," Karen continued, looking at me with an expression far older than 17. "You saved everyone south of here. All of them." I wanted to reject that. It felt too large, too heroic for what had actually happened, which was a man making a desperate agricultural decision in the dark. But the math was the math. 200 infected, moving south at 1 mile per hour, reaching a town of 4,000 people with no warning, no defense, no flooded basin to swallow them. The multiplication of horror that would have followed was calculable, each bite creating a new vector, each new vector expanding the wave. Millhaven would have been overrun by noon. It wasn't just me, I said. Paul designed the dispersal system. Cal wired the western slope. Davis hauled sandbags and felled trees. Grace herded them into deeper water. Karen kept the only record that exists. Ruth kept us fed and sane. Every person at this table played a role. But the water was your idea, Grace said. The land was your sacrifice. Sacrifice. She used that word, and I felt the truth of it settle into me. This wasn't damage. It wasn't loss. It was sacrifice. A deliberate offering of something precious in exchange for something more precious. Colleen would have understood. She would have stood on the porch and watched the soybeans go under, and she would have said, "Earl, the land will forgive you. It always has." After dinner, I stepped outside alone. The basin was a dark mirror under starlight, still and silent, except for the creek's continuous murmur through the gate. Nothing moved in the water, nothing moaned. The surface was peaceful in a way that felt obscene given what it concealed. But peace is peace regardless of what it covers. My phone buzzed. 1 bar of signal, barely enough. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Sergeant Torres, Ohio National Guard. We have reports of a civilian-constructed flood barrier in Mercer County successfully containing a large infected group. Can you confirm location? Extraction and assessment team will deploy at dawn." I typed back my address. Then I sat on the porch step and looked at my ruined farm. And I felt something I hadn't felt since Colleen died. Purpose, not happiness. Nothing about this was happy. Not pride, exactly. The cost was too high for pride. Purpose. The bone-deep sensation that the thing you are good at turned out to be the thing the world needed at the exact moment it needed it. I know drainage. I know gravity. I know how water moves through dirt. And on the night it mattered, that was enough. The military arrived at 7 the next morning. 2 Humvees and a deuce and a half came up the county road and parked at the edge of my property. Sergeant Torres was a compact woman in her 30s with a shaved head and the kind of calm that comes from having already processed the worst and moved to the management phase. She walked the perimeter with Paul, and I watched her expression shift as she took in the scope of what we'd done. "This is field expedient hydraulic denial," she said when she came back. "We teach a version of this at Fort Leonard Wood, but I've never seen it executed by a civilian with farm equipment and sandbags." "I didn't know it had a name," I said. "It doesn't, officially. But it does now. I'm writing this up." Her team began the assessment. They had equipment I didn't recognize, handheld devices they pointed at the water that gave readings on a small screen. "Biocontamination levels," she explained. The pathogen was waterborne at this point, leaching from the submerged bodies into the flood. The water would need to be treated before it could be drained. The bodies would need to be extracted and incinerated. The soil would need to be tested for years before it could be certified safe for agriculture. "Your land is a biohazard zone, Mr. Brundage," Torres said. "I'm sorry. The federal government will compensate you, but I won't lie to you about the timeline. We're talking years." Years. The word should have devastated me. 3 days ago it would have. But standing in the morning light, with 8 people alive behind me and a sergeant telling me my sacrifice had worked. The word years felt like a promise rather than a punishment. Years meant there would be years. Years meant the future still existed. Torres offered evacuation. The helicopter could take all 8 of us to the Springfield safe zone where medical screening, shelter, and food were available. Paul and Cal wanted to go immediately. Ruth wanted Karen somewhere with proper facilities. Grace looked at me, and I looked at the farm. "I'll go last," I said. "Someone needs to maintain the creek gate until your decontamination team gets here. If the water level drops before they extract the bodies, some of them might still be active." Torres studied me. "You want to stay alone on a contaminated property surrounded by submerged infected for an unknown number of days?" "I want to make sure the water holds." She considered this. Then she nodded. "I'll leave you a radio. Military frequency. Daily check-ins at 0800 and 2000. If you miss a check-in, I'm sending a team." "Fair." The others loaded into the vehicles. Davis hugged me on the porch, the first physical contact we'd had in 2 days, and his grip told me everything his words couldn't. Grace shook my hand and said, "Don't be stubborn longer than necessary, Earl." Cal and Ruth thanked me with the formal sincerity of people who know they owe a debt they can never repay. Karen gave me the notebook. "Keep this," she said. "Someone needs to have the record." I took it. The pages were warped from humidity, and her handwriting was small and precise. 206 entries, time-stamped, describing in a teenager's meticulous shorthand the night that the water saved us. The vehicles pulled away. The sound of engines faded. And I was alone on my land for the first time in 2 days. Standing on the porch with a military radio and a girl's notebook and a 40-acre lake full of the dead. The quiet was enormous. Not silence. The creek still spoke through the open gate. Birds were returning to the tree line. The wind moved through the grass on the ridge. But the human sounds were gone. No voices, no crying, no chainsaw, no generator. Just the land and the water and me. I walked to the edge of the basin and I looked at the water. Flat, still. Brown with silt and contamination. Somewhere beneath it, 200 shapes lay in the mud I'd spent my life cultivating. Trapped by the very soil I'd enriched, season after season, with organic matter and careful tillage to make it soft and deep and fertile. The best soil I'd ever built became the best trap I'd ever set. I stayed for 11 days. Sergeant Torres's decontamination team arrived on day 4, with equipment that looked borrowed from a science fiction film. Sealed suits, portable treatment stations, submersible pumps designed to filter biological contaminants from water before discharge. They set up camp on the western ridge, the only dry ground large enough for their vehicles, and they worked methodically from the basin's edges inward. The extraction was something I watched from the porch with binoculars, keeping my distance as instructed. They pulled the bodies out one by one, using a small crane mounted on an amphibious platform. Each body was sealed in a heavy bag and loaded onto a flatbed for transport to an incineration site the military had established at an abandoned quarry 15 miles west. The work was slow and grim, and the soldiers performing it carried themselves with the professional detachment of people doing a job no training could have fully prepared them for. On the 5th day, the team leader, a Major Chen, came to the house to brief me. He spread a map on my kitchen table and showed me the scope of the outbreak. It had originated in a research facility south of Columbus. An accident, he said, with the careful phrasing of someone who'd been told what to call it. The pathogen was fungal in nature, a modified cordyceps variant that had jumped the species barrier. It reactivated motor function in recently deceased tissue by colonizing the brainstem and establishing a primitive neural network that could sustain basic locomotion and predatory behavior. Why does it make them bite? I asked. Transmission strategy. The fungus needs to enter the bloodstream of a new host to propagate. Biting is the most efficient delivery mechanism. The jaw motor function is prioritized in the reanimation sequence because it's the primary vector. The clinical precision of his explanation made my stomach turn. This wasn't a plague from mythology or cinema, it was evolution. Blind, mechanical, utterly devoid of malice. The fungus didn't hate us. It didn't want to destroy civilization. It wanted to reproduce. We were the medium. By day 8, the basin was half drained. The mud was exposed in wide crescents around the edges, dark and saturated, marked with the impressions of bodies that had been removed. It looked like a battlefield after the dead have been collected. Depressions in the earth where shapes had lain. A landscape of negative space. I walked the drained sections with Major Chen. He pointed out features I hadn't noticed during the flooding. The way the mud had captured footprints in perfect preservation. A forensic record of 200 final walks. Some prints were deep, showing where they'd struggled. Others were shallow, barely marking the surface before the figure had toppled. In one area, near the center, the prints clustered densely, overlapping in a chaotic pattern that suggested a group had entered together and gone down in a knot of tangled limbs and churning mud. Your topography saved this region, Chen said. Our models show that without this containment, the infection wave would have reached Millhaven by 10 a.m. that first day. From Millhaven, it would have followed Route 29 south and reached Sydney by nightfall. Sydney to Dayton in 2 days. Your flooded field broke the chain. I didn't know what to say to that. The scale of the consequence, a single decision rippling outward across a map, across communities I'd never visited, protecting lives I'd never know, was beyond my capacity to absorb. I am a farmer. My world has always been bounded by fence lines and property markers and the seasonal rhythm of planting and harvest. To suddenly exist at the center of a regional survival narrative felt like being told the small room you've lived in your whole life is actually a load-bearing wall. On the 11th day, the basin was fully drained and the decontamination was declared complete at the surface level. Deep soil testing would continue for months. The creek gate was closed. The sandbag dam was dismantled. Water flowed back through the culvert and the land began, slowly, to dry. I locked the house. I left the notebook on the kitchen table where Colleen and I used to eat breakfast. I got in my truck. I drove south toward the safe zone in Springfield. In the rearview mirror, the farm got smaller and smaller until it disappeared behind the curve of the road. It's been 9 weeks since the night I opened the gate. I'm living in temporary housing in Springfield, a prefab unit in a complex with 200 others displaced by the outbreak. Davis visits on weekends. Grace is in the unit next to mine, growing tomatoes in buckets on her concrete step because she cannot exist without cultivating something. Cal and Ruth are 4 doors down. Karen sends me letters, actual handwritten letters, from the university in Dayton where she's enrolled in an accelerated emergency management program. She's 17 and she's already being consulted by FEMA because of that notebook. The government made good on compensation. The paperwork is slow, but the commitment is real. I've been told the land will be returned to me when decontamination is certified complete, which could be 2 years or 5. I don't know if I'll go back. The soil I built over 30 years is still there beneath the contamination, still deep, still rich. But what grew in it that night wasn't soybeans. People ask me if I'd do it again. The question frustrates me because it assumes there was a choice. There wasn't. The water was there. The land was there. The infected were coming. I did the only thing the geography allowed. If that's heroism, then heroism is just paying attention to what the ground is telling you and having the nerve to listen. Colleen used to say that the land teaches you everything you need to know if you're patient enough to learn. She was right. The land taught me to flood it, and the water, once released, taught 200 dead things what it means to be still.